Basically, I was 54 years old. I believe brain creates consciousness. I taught neurosurgery at Harvard Medical School for years, and I was in for a big surprise because sudden onset of severe back pain, headache, grand mal epileptic seizures, and I was deep in coma before I was ever taken from my home to the hospital. And then I had a profound spiritual experience that involved multiple levels of reality, and all in the setting where my medical records demonstrated that my brain was far too damaged by this meningitis to have any kind of dream or hallucination. First of all, important to point out that I was amnesic. I had no memory of my life, of Earth or humanity, this universe. It really was an empty slate when I started my journey. And that was all in what I call the earthworm's eye view, a primitive, coarse, unresponsive realm. But then I ascended through this light portal up into this brilliant, ultra real gateway valley. It had many Earth like features, but also rich spiritual features. And the Earth like features were really of an ideal world, kind of a world of perfection. And I witnessed thousands of beings below me dancing, lots of joy and merriment, all being fueled because up above were these swooping orbs of angelic choirs, emanating chants and anthems, hymns that were just stunning in their power. In this setting, I had no body awareness at any point, but I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing, and I was with millions of other butterflies. I cannot words fail me at describing the beauty of this situation. Best part about it, I wasn't alone on the butterfly wing. Beautiful young woman, sparkling blue eyes, high cheekbones, broad forehead, broad smile. She never said a word to me. She didn't have to. But her mind and mine melded together in this beautiful way. And her message to me, as I translated it into words weeks later after I woke up, you are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You are richly cared for. A beautiful message. And I will inform you now that I was adopted. And so I'd spent much of my life with this subconscious feeling that maybe I wasn't even worthy of love. But in many ways, my near death experience resolved all of that with this beautiful girl on the butterfly wing. And of course, those who've read the book of Proof of Heaven realize that 4 months after my coma, when I discovered her identity, it helped me to understand the reality of the situation. But back in my NDE, I ascended to higher and higher levels, again through music. Music is a dominant theme, and the angelic choirs allowed me, my soul, my awareness, to see all of four-dimensional space-time, the material world collapse down. Then this rich spiritual reality, completely outside of Earth time. Very important to point out, there's an eternal realm there that is not slave to Earth time. And that's what I witnessed in this beautiful journey in the Gateway Valley. And then ascended up even further as all of that collapsed down into what I call the core, which was an infinite inky blackness, but filled to overflowing with this love of this God force, of this divinity. And I came back realizing it doesn't matter if we want to label that God, Allah, Brahman, Vishnu, Jehovah, Yahweh, that in fact, it's one force of love, compassion, and kindness that is the origin of all of our awareness. And therefore, such a deep lesson of near-death experiences is that we're in this together to love and take care of each other. And that's a very clear conclusion from my journey and from many others. Now, I would cycle through these realms multiple times. I don't have time to go into all that. But ultimately, there came a point where I could no longer use my memory of the musical notes associated with that initial light portal to bring it back. And I was now stuck in that lowest level, but also surrounded by thousands of people, heads bowed, many holding candles, and their murmuring energy was very comforting to me and drew me in. And I call that in my writings weeks later the power of prayer, because I could see how the prayer of these many beings around me was drawing me back to earth. The very last thing I saw in my NDE, six faces that would kind of bubble up out of that muck. They'd say a few words that I couldn't understand because of the amnesia, and then they'd disappear again. But they were faces of people who were there the last 24 to 48 hours of coma in my ICU room. And therefore, it proved to me that the vast majority of the coma journey had to happen between days 1 and 4 or 1 and 5 of my 7-day coma. I go through all that timing in the books, but it's very important at interpreting my case. And also, I will point out that there's a medical report on my medical records, a peer-reviewed case review. And that case review makes it very clear that my brain was far too damaged to have any kind of dream or hallucination because of the meningitis. So where in the world did this most extraordinary experience I'd ever had come from? And that is, of course, the big subject of the book, that in fact, consciousness is not created by the brain, but the brain is a filter that allows us to experience this universal God consciousness, but all as individual beings. But ultimately, we're never separate from that source of consciousness, that rich God love that so many NDEers have found on their journeys. It took me 2 months after I woke up from this coma. Initially, my brain was frazzled. I didn't even recognize my mother, my sisters, my sons at the bedside. All I knew was this extraordinary journey I'd just been through. But all my memories came back. And in fact, they were even more complete after 2 months than they had been before the coma. So I've spent 17 years since then as a neuroscientist working with other scientists and other experiencers to better understand the nature of consciousness, to support this reality of the eternity of soul and of our soul connection. You know, when I first woke up from coma, the only thing I knew about my existence was this incredible spiritual journey I had just been on. And that was without any knowledge of my prior life or earth or humans or anything. And so waking up from this coma, fighting the ventilator, and they finally took out the breathing tube. But that at that early stage, I didn't even recognize my mother and my sisters and my sons. That amnesia was very powerful. And I only discovered in the weeks and months after coma why the amnesia was necessary and why I had to have the spiritual guide that I had. If I had scripted this, that would have been my adoptive father, the world-renowned neurosurgeon who had raised me. He was tremendous influence in my life. And yet, surprisingly to me, he was nowhere to be found in the NDE itself. I had instead this beautiful young woman. And 4 months after my coma, that's when I discovered her identity. That has a lot to do with my adoption history and my birth family, who I had just met 1 year before coma, and has to do with a sister, a young sister, a birth sister who was lost to me 2 years before I even knew of her existence. But that is where, it all started to come together after I woke up from coma, even though I still had about 36 hours of a paranoid, delusional, psychotic nightmare. But I knew that was delusion, as opposed to the deep spiritual journey, the memories of which are as sharp and crisp today in my mind as if they happened yesterday. Whereas that 36-hour paranoid, delusional, psychotic, ICU psychosis I had after I was taken off the ventilator, those memories disappeared within weeks. So the richness and the reality of the journey has been with me all along. Everything else of my life has been kind of added onto it after the fact. But when I woke up from coma, that was an astonishing revelation about the nature of reality that I then had to kind of build into my understanding as the rest of my memories and kind of cognitive abilities returned over several months. Initially, as I'm awakening and then over the next few days, remembering my family and interacting with them and with my doctors, I tried to share my story. And I remember specifically telling one of my doctor colleagues about this extraordinary vision I had during my coma. And he just patted me on the back and said, "Oh, your brain was soaking in pus. We have no idea how you've even come back to us, but you can forget about it because the dying brain plays all kinds of tricks." So initially, and my neurosurgical knowledge was not back yet, took 2 months to get all that back. And also, I was not yet aware of the medical records in my case that showed just how badly damaged my brain was. So when the doctors were first saying, "Oh, you can forget about it, it had to be a hallucination," I just assumed, wow, that was a hallucination. But wow, was it extraordinary. and I wanted to record it all. I wanted to write it all down. And I remember it was 2 days after I got out of the hospital, a day before Thanksgiving back in 2008, when my oldest son, Eben the fourth, who was majoring in neuroscience in college at the time, he drove home because he heard that I'd been staying up all night because I was so energized by all this. And I remember he gave me a big hug, and he told me later it was like a light was shining within me, that I was far more present than I'd ever been before. And I told him, well, it was way too real to be real. That was the way I explained it. And that's when he told me to write everything down that I could remember before I read anyone else's near-death experience. Now, I'd never read that literature because I always thought it was just nonsense, hallucinations of the dying brain. But at this point, I really wanted to study other cases and read others. But he said, no, don't do that. Write everything down first. So over about 6 weeks, I wrote 20,000 words, and that was my raw database of the experience itself. Only then did I start diving into other near-death experience cases and was shocked to find a tremendous amount of overlap with my case, but also some differences, especially realizing that that guardian angel, the beautiful woman on the butterfly wing, turned out to be, I found out 4 months later, that was my birth sister from my birth family. And she had died 2 years before I even found out about her existence. But much, much later, as I'm reviewing all these NDE cases, I'm going, well, who in the world was that beautiful woman? And why wasn't my father there, my adoptive father? He was the one who was so important in my life. He had passed over 4 years before my coma. And in the third book that we've written on this whole topic, that book is published in Spanish. In English, it's Living in a Mindful Universe. And I think in Spanish, it's Infinite Consciencia. But in that book, we describe a meditative experience I had 2.5 years after my coma, in which my adoptive father appeared. And he told me, and very clearly told me that he could not be apparent to me. You know, apparent being the word be seen, but the double meaning of that was he could not be my parent and not be there guiding me in the journey, but that it had to be this removal of a birth sister I had never known. And I realized why that was, because if it had been my adoptive father, who was my spiritual guide, I would have, in spite of a 1 in 10 million diagnosis, E. coli meningitis in an adult, in spite of a 1 in a billion recovery, which is confirmed in the medical case report, how rare it is and unusual that I recovered. But in spite of those rarities, if my father had been the one there to escort me, I might have defaulted to my old materialist worldviews that you only see who you want to see on the way out, and that it was wishful thinking. By removing that layer and not having him there, but instead having a birth sister I had never known, but who was very important to me in my life because of her connection through the birth family, that's where I recognized the power of the story and started really learning from my experience. The reaction of those around me, I mean, my family initially was very excited to see me coming back because the doctors had predicted I was going to die from this. In fact, that day they had recommended stopping antibiotics and taking me off the ventilator. But quickly, you know, within minutes and hours, they realized my brain was still very badly damaged. So I think initially my family was very concerned that, yes, I might live, but I might be horribly damaged. My doctors, as I said, they would just tell me the dying brain plays all kinds of tricks. But important to point out that I was invited to my own morbidity mortality conference. Those are the conferences we have in medicine to discuss very difficult cases, usually with people who die or have a terrible outcome. Well, my doctors at my hospital were all fascinated by my recovery. Believe me, the word had gotten out about this kind of miraculous situation. And so they invited me, first of all, to my own morbidity mortality conference because they wanted me to comment on how I thought I'd had such a miraculous recovery. But then the county medical society, again, many doctors who knew of this case, this extraordinary case, invited me to give a dinner speech at a country club there. And there were about 120 doctors from my hospital and their spouses who attended this meeting. They wanted to hear more about it. So this was not just my thinking, wow, I had an incredible experience. This was the whole medical community going, oh my God, this is miraculous. How did this happen? And they needed an explanation beyond, our simple medical explanations, because those don't work. My case was really unprecedented in the medical literature. And then I found out that there are doctors and scientists and physicists and people who are deeply into science who have studied these kind of cases for decades, if not centuries. And in fact, one of the main groups on Earth studying such cases was 60 miles up the road from me at the University of Virginia. And there, for 6 decades, they had been studying near-death experiences, after-death communications. They'd been studying past life memories in children, indicating reincarnation. They were scientifically interested in consciousness as it extends beyond the limits of the brain itself. And so that was a group I then started working with about 2 years after my coma. And ever since then, I've come to connect with many other scientists who are going along this pathway. And the one web resource I will give you for all your viewers who want to learn more about the scientific proof of the afterlife, just go to bigelowinstitute.org. That's a website with 29 essays, and that will teach you a tremendous amount about scientific support for the reality of the afterlife. I would say that my near-death experience was a tremendous gift. It completely changed my life 180 degrees. I mentioned earlier that I was adopted. My birth mother was 16. She was unwed. At age 11 days, I was failing to thrive, and I was put in a hospital. And then social services would not give me back to her, but she was unwilling to sign the papers to give me up. So I spent 4 months in a baby dorm waiting to be adopted. Now, I couldn't have been more fortunate. I was adopted into a wonderful, loving family with one older adopted sister, and then later 2 younger biological sisters of my adoptive parents. And they were wonderful for me. But there was always that deep kind of questioning in my mind. The fact that I was abandoned by my own mother at such an early age led to some subconscious doubts about whether or not I even deserved to exist and was I worthy of love. And so I think for much of my life, I kind of struggled with that. I did have some trouble with addiction. I had to stop drinking alcohol in 1991. That was very early in my training. It was never a problem at work, but alcohol was an issue. And also the birth wound of being left behind by my mother. My NDE very powerfully connected me with the universe, with God, in a way that has been very refreshing. And the 17 years since my coma, I've adopted a very powerful view that I would label, if we had to put a philosophical label, evolutionary panentheism. It's an advanced form of idealism, which basically promotes the primacy of mind, and that the physical universe is emergent from the mental, not the other way around. Our conventional scientific thinking is the brain creates consciousness. It's that only the material or physical world exists. And that conventional view is being left behind because it's completely inadequate. And now, as scientists expand their view of reality, what we're coming to realize is mind seems to be primary. Quantum physics itself is trying to tell us in very powerful terms that mind in the realm of the mental is what determines physical events in the physical universe, but that ultimately we have free will and we have the ability to change and improve and modulate our emerging reality. And this is why this revolution that I'm talking about, that hinges on near-death experiences and what they reveal about our souls and our interconnection as souls with basically the soul of the universe, is very refreshing and reminds us that we're here to take care of each other. Take care of the least, the last, and the lost. That includes refugees. It includes all people on earth and other beings. I mean, this beautiful love, kindness, compassion that's such an important part of the near-death experience message also involves animals. We need to take better care of our fellow beings and of the planet at large. That's one of the biggest messages that comes out of near-death experiences, especially when you look at what's called the life review. And life reviews can very simply be stated as the golden rule: treat others as you would like to be treated. And this is fundamental in the universe based on the lessons of near-death experiences. Well, my message to those who are facing death, either in themselves or in a loved one, is simply to realize that all the evidence we have, based on millions of cases, based on scientific studies, and based on, my own case is only one of many, and of course, I've had thousands of people share their own cases with me. What I can tell you is that when we die, it's actually an expansion of our conscious awareness. It's a reuniting with the souls of departed loved ones, and it's an ability to connect with the souls of those still embodied here on earth across space and time. So it's a beautiful demonstration that we are truly connected to a God force of pure love that can bring wholeness and healing into our lives. And the more we reflect that in our decisions and how we interact with people, the smoother our journey will be when we leave the physical body, because we go through life reviews. And the life review also involves experiencing the events of your life from the perspective of everyone involved. So if you've been busy handing out pain and suffering to others, in your life review, you're in their shoes and you'll feel what that felt like to be receiving what you were dishing out. This is why it's so important to say, treat others as you would like to be treated. That's exactly what life reviews are teaching us. And the ultimate lesson for humanity is we need to be kind and show love and care for all of our fellow beings. We find that out when we pass from this world. We also recognize that there is a reincarnation, that our souls come back. And I believe that they often come back in groups so that we might shift roles. Our souls do not have a gender. They don't have a skin color. But when we come back into this world, I think it's often reshuffled, all in ways that we can learn and teach each other in growing in these lives. So death of the body is not the end of conscious awareness, and it is not the end of our loving relationships with those we really care for. I think the main thing I'd like to add is that you don't have to have a near-death experience to come to this knowledge. If you're familiar with near-death experiences and read about them, fine, that's a good start. But ultimately, this is about recognizing that you are much more than your physical body and your little ego mind. This is where prayer and meditation are absolutely essential. For me, centering prayer, a kind of a complete giving to the higher will of God is a beautiful way to do this, or meditation. And for those who need meditation, because ultimately meditation is about taking the little voice in our head, which is not our consciousness. The voice in our head is the voice of our ego, our linguistic brain. And it's important to silence that, because the little ego basically uses fear and anxiety to control us. And so in meditation, we can set that little voice into timeout. Now, for me in meditation, the voice in my head might make a request, ask a question, but then I've learned to use a tool. That tool is a form of differential frequency brainwave entrainment. It's called Sacred Acoustics. You can learn more at sacredacoustics.com. And full disclosure, that is the website of my wife, my partner and co-author of Living the Mindful Universe, Karen Newell. But we discovered more than a decade ago, I discovered that binaural beats, that is slightly different frequencies to the two ears, can have a very powerful effect on our consciousness. And it causes an oscillation down in the very primitive lower parts of the brainstem. And that left-right oscillation that comes from these audio tones delivered through headphones or earbuds can help people get into a very deep transcendental state of conscious awareness. For people who want to learn more about that, go to sacredacoustics.com. I can tell you I use that form of meditation an hour to a day. I've been doing that for more than 12 years now. It's incredibly powerful, not just to recover memories of my near-death experience, but to help me develop ongoing relationships with the various guiding forces, like the soul of my adoptive father and of my birth sister, and others that I've discovered during meditation, as well as a connection with God, with that beautiful, loving force at the core of the universe. Well, when the book Proof of Heaven first came out, there was a tremendously positive response. In fact, the very first week it was out, it went to #1 on the New York Times bestseller list for nonfiction. In fact, over the next 2 years, the book Proof of Heaven was #1 on the New York Times list 42 weeks. In fact, in the year 2013, the book Proof of Heaven was the #2 best-selling book of the whole year for nonfiction titles on the New York Times list. It's also been published in more than 40 languages. I know from the response I've gotten back from many people that what I think really happened was so many people have had these kind of experiences, and yet they don't share them. They're scared people will think they're crazy. And so they keep it to themselves. And many people read my book, and all of a sudden, wham, they recognize their own experience. The similarities can be quite stunning. And that's why so many people were interested in the book Proof of Heaven. And of course, they've also been interested in the follow-up books, The Map of Heaven and Living in a Mindful Universe. But Proof of Heaven was really the one that kind of took the world by storm.
This has been the A.J. Parr Spiritual Journalist Podcast. Please like, share, and subscribe.